One jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal. Oh, to start the morning, the warden bawling, get out of bed and clean your prison cell, and the old triangle, one jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal. The screw was peeping and the light was dreaming as he lay weeping for his little son, and the old triangle, one jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal. On a fine spring evening, the light lay dreaming, and the seagulls were wheeling high above the wall. The old triangle, one jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal. The wind was sighing and the day was dying, and the boy lay crying in his prison cell. The old triangle, one jingle bloody jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal. In the women's prison, there are 70 women, and I wish it was with them that I didn't dwell. And that old triangle could go jingle jangle all along the banks of the Royal Canal.
Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast are to give some introductory remarks to Brendan Behan's 1954 play, The Quare Fella. Immediately following this address, we will have a private seminar where we will chit-chat about this work and about some of the themes. The purpose here are to lubricate some discussion points and to make sure we're all topically in motion and we get a bit of momentum here and get ourselves in the right headspace for this notable play. Before we get too deep into things, I bring to your attention the Open Events series here at Apocatastasis. There are many ways you may attach yourself to the college. The most perfect way, of course, is to enroll in our 3-year undergraduate program. This is meant to replace typical high school studies completely or typical traditional age college undergraduate studies. This is a very intensive program where you will study in a way quite literally unique to any school out there, human life on this planet, particularly through the lens of philosophy, history, literature, and art in an integrated fashion. This is our top shelf offering. Other ways you may attach yourself to the college is to enroll in individual courses, monthly seminars, our Substack education program, and here, a noble route, the open events. We offer regular mini series of a sort on topics, and typically they're of a literary or historical interest. This season of Grace, we've looked at Rabbi Berens and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Today, Brendan Behan. Next month, Tennessee Williams. And finishing off this semester, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So quite a diverse offering altogether. And the monies raised through our open events are a fine way, as are all the monies raised for Apocatastasis, to help grow this work as we move towards a campus. Before we even begin that work, we must stabilize our income, and the open events fees are very appreciated towards that end. Now, there will be, and this is appropriate to the Quare fella, a look at Oscar Wilde's time in prison. By the way, that was not a Freudian slip. Okay, Oscar Wilde's a Quare fella of another sort, Brendan Behan had in mind. But we will be looking, as we do every year here at Apocatastasis, at Oscar Wilde. And we do that around the time of Holy Week and Easter week through the Ballad of Reading Jail, the Essay de Profundus, and we usually work in some other piece of Wilde's. I think for Easter time, we'll look at some of Wilde's children's stories. Most accomplished author. In fact, he's probably the only author who has a notable work in every genre of literature: poetry, play, prose, essay, and so forth. So keep an eye out. And I think Oscar Wilde and his time in jail actually influenced a lot of Brendan Behan's considerations in the Quare fella, in Borstal Boy, his memoir of Behan's own time in what we call in America juvenile hall, or at Behan's time and place, Borstal. So there's a lot of crossover there. Of course, Behan and Wilde, both men of the pen. Now, we are looking at the Quare fella. Well, let's see. Are you looking at that? Let's see. If I click on this real fast, I can see. I suspect my little green bubble is blocking the title, but you'll have to take my word for it. This is a publication of Behan's play. 1954 is the first production of this piece. It was famously something that Joan Littlewood and her theater brought over to England, and that got Behan a great deal of press. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. I did also want to say, before we look at some of the themes here, that the opening song, the Old Triangle, comes from the Quare fella, and we have the different stanzas being sung as the play progresses. This is probably Brendan Behan's most famous song, the Old Triangle, and we want to remember that Behan came from a very creative family altogether. Padraig Carney, who wrote the Irish national anthem, a soldier song, and a great deal of other notable works. What's this song? I have a true love if ever a girl had one. Golden Ribbon 3, Ribbon, something like that. Anyway, he did a lot of notable songs. Padraig Carney was I think Behan's uncle. A lot of activity, political activity, on the part of his own family. His father was in the Anglo-Irish War and the Civil War. That, of course, affects Behan's own life. The ripe old age of 16, he's nabbed in England for setting bombs, and that takes him to juvie because of his age, and that eventually, many years later, would produce Borstal Boy, his memories and memoirs of that time period in jail for his IRA activities. But many songs can be attributed to the Behans, not just Brendan Behan, but also Dominic Behan. And in fact, the cut that you heard at the beginning of this presentation, bumper music, was by Zoe Behan, who presently lives in Australia, and someone whom I've interviewed many years ago. It must be 2018 or 2019. And she was very gracious to sit down for an interview and talk about her own family history and her own art of a more plastic sort than music, although, as you can see, she's quite capable of the singing as well. And actually, I think in an early part in her life was in a band. So that was Zoe Behan. And getting back to Brendan here, after his time in Borstal, he mucks around as a painter for a while. Some people think he was a pimp in Paris for a while. There is a sequel to Borstal Boy, Confessions of an Irish Rebel. But the most notable output of Brendan Behan would be Borstal, The Quare Fella Today, and The Hostage. Well, those are the three biggies. And what happened, of course, is his fame, in a sense, did him in. He got a reputation, especially in Britain, and especially in America, for being quite a partier. And this, unfortunately, is what happens to a lot of people in fame. You're in public, you're also in bars a lot, restaurants, people want to buy you drinks, and you don't want to say no to them. And so Brendan's drinking gets the best of him altogether. In addition, he was a diabetic, and I believe had a sweet spot for sherry, which no diabetic has any business being around. And that did a hell of a number on his system. So he dies very, very young. And in fact, at the end of this address, I will, appropriate to the Quare Fella and the theme of anti-capital punishment, sew in a clip, the very last clip that we have of Brendan Behan a couple of days before he died, where he was run down by a news crew to give his drunken thoughts on capital punishment. But what comes through in that clip, as you will see, what came through in Zoe Behan's adaptation of The Old Triangle, what comes through altogether in The Quare Fella, Borstal Boy, The Hostage, Confessions of an Irish Rebel, his songs, and his witticisms and so forth, is Brendan Behan's humanity. And that is what recommends him to, well, an institute for the humanities, let's say. And that pathos which comes up again and again in his writings. I should say, by the early 60s, his drinking had so mastered his life that much of what he's, quote unquote, putting out by that point is stuff that his agents are recording, and usually recording between drinking bouts and so forth, sometimes during drinking bouts. And then the agents are the ones that are compiling Richard Cork's Leg and Confessions of an Irish Rebel and Brendan Behan's America and this sort of thing. So it's an unfortunate aspect. I guess it's not a new observation to say addiction often attends creative sorts. So anyway, his closing output is not altogether his, frankly, and it's not the strongest. of him. He was not in the strongest position, health-wise and in his mind at that point. And nevertheless, though, the pathos of the man comes through, and that's what, of course, inspired all sorts of memories of him, and I think that's why he stayed relevant. Always a dangerous word, of course. He stayed relevant and in the consciousness of many of us who like to imagine we're literate and so forth, is that overarching aspect. So anyway, that's a bit about Brendan Behan. And the Quare fella in particular is a short play. It's only about 90 pages altogether. I will link the document down below. And if I can't do that, I'll just send you in the right direction on archive.org or whatever. Enjoy it while you have it. I don't think that website's going to be around indefinitely. But yeah, the Quare fella, like the Borscht Boy, deals with prison, but of a much darker sort. It deals with a man. We don't know his name. We know his number, E something something, E99 whatever. We don't know that. We don't really know much about him. He murdered somebody. Again, we can see some themes here with Oscar Wilde and his Ballad of Reading Jail, which is a similar meditation on an unknown prisoner. In fact, Oscar Wilde will dedicate that poem to whatever, E558, I don't know, whatever that man's name was, who was executed in Wilde's stint in jail, his 2 years in jail. We don't have their names. And this is Joan Littlewood, by the way, who produces the Quare fella, as I say, and that brings Brendan Behan in the spotlight. And this is in Britain. Joan Littlewood had quite an avant-garde theater in her time, and quite a long career. In fact, she died at 87. And very working class look, a look at storytelling from angles that you typically didn't get in theater of that time. And of course, Joan Littlewood not only gave Brendan Behan a leg up in the limelight, but also Shayna Delaney and The Taste of Honey, which is still being produced. I have that play in one of my boxes of books, and I have not read it, but I look forward to reading it, and I'll perhaps report on it sometime. We're dealing with just a few hours, really, before a man's execution, the Quare fella's execution. That's the whole focus of the play. And not only do we have little about our subject, we don't have a definite protagonist either. There is no one character who's leading the motion of the play. In a sense, the system is the protagonist or the antagonist or the tagonist. Interesting to know what that origin word is. But in any case, there is not a protagonist to this story. There are many characters of the system, of the bureaucracy, prison guards, doctors, the hangman, whom we spend a great deal of time with. I guess the hangman, it would be as close as you get to a protagonist in the sense that he's the one that everyone's waiting for. Then you have the prisoners. You have the unknown singer who throughout the play is singing the stanzas that become the old triangle. And we don't know about him. He's just a voice from below, literally from below, in the sense that he's in the hole. He's in solitary confinement. And half of the play takes place within the prison and then half on the yard. And in either instance, the prisoner in the hole is able to occasionally belt out a stanza of this melancholy song, the old triangle. But we don't know him. He's just a voice. And we don't know the Quare fella. And that's the point. One of Behan's themes in this is the anonymity of the system. And so you have these intense personal crimes that get people into this institution, and then they lose their identity. And how there's just this machine operation going on. And we'll close out before we have the clip from Behan with an example of that, the impersonality. So you're trying to reform people in these modern prisons. In America, we call them penitentiaries or reformatories. And there's this idea of just that, of starting over again, right? The penitent converts. from his wicked ways. The penitentiary is the place where you convert from your wicked ways. And yet, as indeed Oscar Wilde reminds us from part 5 of the Ballad of Reading Gaol, it is only what is good in man that wastes and withers in prison. And that the nominal reason for prisons after the Enlightenment are to reform people, and yet they don't do that at all. On the one point, we have again that prisons don't. That how can you, to the Quare fellow's observation, how can you reform the individual if you strip them of their individuality altogether? So you have that aspect. Another major theme, indeed, is capital punishment, and indeed the bureaucratization of that. And there's a long, in a sense, it is the climax of the Quare fellow. There's a long discourse as these policemen are effectively taking a cigarette break on the yard, and they're chit-chatting about the hangman that's coming over from England. The hangman from across the sea in many Irish songs, indeed. They're talking about this man, and they're going through the night before his job. A lot of attention is paid to the Quare fella and the ritual of the bureaucracy of him, right? The last meal and the preparing of the grave, and repeated mention of not just the noose, but the washer that secures the noose, the hardware washer, and that. But there's also this attention given to the hangman and his routine, because these executions are scheduled, and they know they see him every so many months, and so he has a routine, and he gets his ticket, and they know him at the ferry coming over from England. And they know him at the bar the night before an execution. They know what drink he's going to have, and he calls his wife at this time. And there's this normalization of something that is by definition not normal. You don't die and you don't kill people regularly. At least most of us don't, and none of us die regularly. And so there's this juxtaposition of the ordinary, the mundane, and the extraordinary. As I mentioned, Brendan Behan's pathos for humanity and his humor as well comes through in all of his work. And you see that in no shortage here in the Quare fella, this sort of dark humor that comes through, but humor nonetheless, and the humanity of humor. It's interesting. I'm struck right now that they sound to have and seem to have the same root word, humus, earthy. If I say my humor is earthy, it has a certain connotation. I'm a human. I come from humus. I come from earth, humor. Interesting that it's the word is the same. There's something in the soil about humor. There's something about the human being that's so visceral about us that we have, and there's something so human about humor that the words are close. And so even in this horrible place, this prison, you have that shining through the humor, and we see that early on in the play, where a couple prisoners do what prisoners always mention doing in memoirs, and that is finding excuses to go to the doctor and to take it easy for a bit. And so these two men are complaining about their legs being at them, and while the doctor is kneeling down and applying lotions and potions and salves and ointments, the men are telling him, look lower, it's this muscle, it's this tendon, please help me. And as they're doing that, they're swigging the bottle of medicinal alcohol on the doctor's table, right? They're getting away with it while he's effectively distracted. So we have that coming out. We have, of course, just like humor, we also have the accents, the beautiful Irish accent that you can enjoy on the archive.org recording of the play. Interestingly, the old Triangle song has a much jazzier, rather 1960s setting in the around 1950s setting in the original production, which is recorded, than the more wistful versions you see nowadays. I should say that recording by Zoe Behan of the Old Triangle was the model and pattern for the first guitar song I learned. That was the first serious guitar song beyond just basic two-chord songs, and the first strumming song that I was able to master. And if you were to hear me do my adaptation of the Old Triangle, you would see the influence of that particular recording by Zoe. Howsoever, yes, the Irish accent also is another testimony to the human soul still existing in this very mechanistic modern prison. All right, and then just a few points here, and we'll wind things down. So I thought to just recite some from this meditation on Behan. So Behan's works are generally not easy to source online for free. However, there are copies of several plays, including the Quare from the Open Library. Okay, why read this? Behan was vehemently opposed to capital punishment. The Quare was certainly influenced by the hanging of a man Behan knew, named Bernard Kirwan, who was executed in 1943. Kirwan's crime is practically identical to the murder carried out by the fictional Quare. And that's interesting. That's another theme here in this play is class. And you have this dialogue between prisoners. I think the guys who are in the doctor's office as they're waiting about murderers. And there's this quip to the effect of, the upper class murderers kill their girlfriends and wives with their canes. They have the decency to bump them on the head with their canes. And it's the lower sort who go for the murders with butcher knives and garrettes and so forth. So there's that consciousness of class. And we see that from Behan's own involvement with the IRA, which of course has a very socialist component. Historically, in fact, a little bit later, after Behan, the IRA would split, as it's done a few times, in fact. It would split, I think, in 1973 over the topic of nationalism versus the left consciousness. Neither here nor there, except to say that class consciousness, Behan coming from that left-wing strand of Irish politics. As he quips, in fact, in a recording, neither you nor he can make any sense of the combination of Irish Catholicism and left-wing politics that you see historically in Ireland. Ireland and its politics are actually very similar in that regard to South America, where the church and Christians tend to not ally with the conservatives. That's a very North American and Northern European phenomena. So Ireland, in many respects, is more similar to the Hispanic countries in that and indeed in other ways. Okay, so we have the class consciousness, and while some readers may consider capital punishment an anachronistic topic for a play, it is unfortunately still practiced in many countries, and was obviously in use in Ireland when the play was written. Behan himself served a total of 8 years in prison. Some of those in Borscht, and then again, you read about this in Confessions of an Irish Rebel. He's picked up again in his early 20s, I think for breaking parole or something like that. Therefore, he was intimately familiar with the stories of hangings and even some of the victims. And this resulted in a genuinely affecting piece of drama. Importantly, the playwright never reveals the reactions of the condemned man, but focuses instead on all those around him, very similar to Oscar Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol. We hope you may join us around Holy Week and Easter for that set of presentations. The convicted man at the play center remains silent, which symbolizes his utter powerlessness. Within the play, details are provided about hangings that are quite horrifying. Behan impresses upon his audience that society finds such punishments. Funds, F-U-N-D-S, funds, that society funds such punishments, and he aims to expose the sort of details of a barbaric practice that crucially relies on public support to continue. Like many public crimes, it's often swept under the rug. In short, any system of justice is only as healthy as the society that supports it, and the playwright confronts this rather thorny issue. A prison should, in theory, hold characters that are basically rotten apples. Some more rotten than others, but at least all criminals. However, Behan consciously avoids the kind of binary simplicity that suggests that high prison walls separate the good in society from those who are feared and justifiably locked away. Readers bear witness to highly subjective views expressed by the prisoners and warders alike that serve to further muddy the crystal clear waters of one's judgment. Not all prisoners' crimes are revealed, but we do learn of a murderer, a sex offender, petty criminal, smuggler, and an embezzler. The hierarchy of crimes, especially as judged by the prisoners themselves, leads to some confusion. For example, two murderers are treated entirely different, both by their fellow prisoners and indeed in judicial terms too, hinting strongly at the influence of class distinctions. Then the sex offender, whose specific crime is never revealed, expresses his disgust at being housed amongst murderers. The other prisoners treat him as a pariah. However, the sex offender ironically shows respect for the Holy Bible. The petty criminal, called Neighbor, is clearly a recidivist, but has never done anything worse than steal insignificant amounts of money and alcohol. Behan unexpectedly presents this character, who is most familiar with jail, as arguably the most malign figure of the entire play. The playwright is not rehearsing what is nowadays considered an obvious and tired model. Incarceration becomes a school for criminals. He suggests instead that imprisonment inwardly rots a man's character, and this is an issue that is weirdly separable from actions, such as the crimes themselves. The playwright presents a nuanced depiction of good and bad that is thought-provoking and sometimes challenging. Autem Domine miserere nobis. So those are some thoughts about this play. And just one final note, there's this discourse about the impersonalism of the prison, which is meant to reform persons. And they're going back and forth. So occasionally the prison guards, the warders as they're called, will use the prisoners for free labor. That's nothing new. We have a whole federal corporation in America to steal prisoners' labor called Unicor. A lot of your IKEA furniture is actually made by slaves in the United States prisons. A lot of your food from Aldi's, actually most of your food from Aldi's comes from prison farms. That's one of the reasons, in fact, that's the chief reason Aldi's food is so inexpensive, is it's from slave labor. All right, anyhow, in such an arrangement, we have the chief speaking to a prisoner whose job is to chisel a headstone for the Quare fella once he's killed. And the chief says, yes, that's it. You're to carve E777. Got that? Yes, sir. E777. That's it. The chief says, it should be E779, according to the book. But a 7 is easier for you to carve than a 9. Right? The stone in the wall that's nearest to the spot. Go ahead now, raising his voice. There's the usual 2 bottles of stout a man, but only if you work fast. So we have the humanity peeking through it. The man will work for a couple of bottles of beer. It'll sweeten the deal. And yet, the Quare fellow, we don't know his name. And we don't even know the proper bureaucratic designation, because it's easier, he's going to have an incorrect thing chiseled for his headstone in the foundation of the prison. I know the worst fella was making this noise, sir. It was Mixter, sir. I'm going in case to case him now. I'll take an hour's overtime to do it, sir. You're a bit late. He was going out this morning and had his civilian clothing on in the cell. We were only waiting for this to be over to let him out. But, sir, he was the whole cause. And it goes on here. I just wanted to point out just this in terms of earlier themes that I've laid out. This point about the headstone carving, both the humanity of lubricating the prisoner's work with beer, and then the impersonalism of, again, an institution meant to reform a person. All right, so there we go. Some additional introductory thoughts on top of your thoughts concerning the Quare Fellow by Brendan Behan. For those of you watching after the fact, please do consider coming to our open event series here at the college. This is a good way to continue your own enrichment and education, and to do it in a communal fashion. And then for those of you joining us live, just hang on after the clip from Brendan Behan, and we'll go immediately into a discussion of the Quare Fella.
And for another viewpoint on the question of the abolition of capital punishment, here is Brendan Behan.
Well, it is not, John, my usual form to praise ministers for justice for various reasons which are not explicable on a television air. But the move of the present Minister for Justice shows a good heart and an Irish heart. And I don't tell you this about it. And nobody that was ever inside before likes going to the gallows, because in various cases people have swung for a half hour or maybe an hour, or just left there in the pit. And if they happen to be a Catholic, or they slit the hoods so that the priests can anoint them. Well, I think the priest has the worst job of the lot.